In the last section, we created our Docker file and built a new image for our new application. We should now be able to start up our application by running docker run, and then we'll specify the image we just created. So you will put in your Docker username / visits. Now remember, you do not have to specify the tag by putting on colon latest at the end, but you optionally can if you want to. So we can run this right here, and it will start up our application. Now you'll notice that we immediately get an error message. It says Redis connection to something 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 failed. So our application is attempting to start up, but there's no Redis server running for it to connect to. So in this section, we're going to focus on getting a separate container running a Redis server. Now, as far as getting up a separate Redis server goes, well, it's going to be pretty darn straightforward. We're going to run the same exact command that we've ran throughout this course. I'll run docker run Redis, like so. And so that's going to reach out to the Docker hub. It's going to pull down the Redis instance, and it'll start up a copy of Redis on our local machine. And boom, just like that, there's our Redis server. So that's it. That's the Redis instance we're going to use. No customization to the Docker image for it whatsoever. So now that we have our our Redis server running, I'm going to open up a second terminal window. And inside the second window, I'll now try running docker run my image again. So I'll say docker run Stephen Greider / visits. Let's run that. And you'll notice, well, it looks like we still have the same error message we had before, even though we are now running a Redis server inside of a separate container. So what's the problem? Well, let's think about it for a second. Here's what's going on your computer right now. You've got a Node application in one container and the Redis application in the separate Docker container. Now, these two containers do not have any automatic communication between the two whatsoever. They are two absolutely isolated processes that don't have any communication. So in order to make sure that our Node app has the ability to kind of reach out to the Redis server and store information or work with it in some fashion, we need to set up some networking infrastructure between the two. Now, when it comes to setting up some networking functionality between two separate containers, we have, for right now, two options to look at. So here's our two options. We can either make use of the Docker CLI that we've been making use of throughout this course so far. I'm talking about the Docker command that we've been using at our terminal throughout this entire course. This built-in Docker CLI has functionality tied to it that will allow us to set up a network between two separate containers. However, there's a little issue with it. And the issue is basically just that it's a real pain in the neck to do. When you make use of Docker CLI to set up some networking, it's going to involve a handful of different commands that have to be reran every single time you start up your different containers. Now, of course, we could make some type of little script to run all that stuff for us, but certainly it's going to involve a lot of typing and a lot of thought on how we're going to set up all this networking stuff. I'm going to be honest with you, I have just about never seen people in industry ever making use of Docker's built-in the Docker CLI, let me be very clear here, never making use of Docker CLI's built-in networking features to connect two containers together. Much more frequently, what you're going to see and what you and I are going to do inside this course is we're going to make use of a separate CLI tool called Docker Compose. Docker Compose is a separate tool that gets installed along with Docker. So if you right now flip back over to your terminal and run docker-compose like so, you should see some content appear on the screen, and we'll list out a series of different commands for you to run. Docker Compose is a separate CLI. It's already installed on your machine. Now, when you start introducing Docker Compose, it's going to very quickly start getting confusing what Docker Compose does and what Docker CLI does and what the relationship between the two is. So the best thing I could tell you is that Docker Compose really exists to keep you from having to write out a ton of different repetitive commands with the Docker CLI. So throughout this course, we've been running stuff like docker run and docker attach and exec, and we've been specifying ports and tags and all this stuff just all the time. Now, definitely as we learn this stuff, we need to use Docker CLI and learn it. But at a certain point in time, you say, okay, I understand this Docker CLI stuff, and you get tired of writing out those commands. And so one of the big purposes of Docker Compose is to just avoid having to write out all these really annoying tiny little options every time you want to start up a container. The other big thing that Docker Compose is going to do for us is it's going to make it very easy and very straightforward to start up multiple Docker containers at the same time and automatically connect them together with some form of networking. And it's all going to happen behind the scenes for us quite automatically. So again, as soon as you start seeing this terminology here of Docker Compose, keeping all these Docker terms straight in your head gets a little bit confusing, but I'm going to tell you this right now. I'm going to repeat it several times. The purpose of Docker Compose is to essentially function as Docker CLI, but allow you to kind of issue multiple commands much more quickly. So let's take a quick break right here. We're going to come back to the next section, and we're going to get a little bit more familiar with Docker Compose and how it works.